As much as science is producing knowledge, there is a disconnect that the knowledge produced sometimes by science is not getting to politicians or is not being utilized.
Then, a rhetorical question there is, what are the priorities? Is it that most of our policymakers are only ignorant, they do not appreciate the role of research in contributing to the African development? Or is it that we have very few resources and that need to be invested?
Societies and people living in Africa do have experiences in managing their futures which we do not have. So what can we learn from the way how people and societies in Africa make their own futures?
Welcome to the University of Bonn and to the project The Future Lies in Africa here at the Berlin Science Week. We are very glad that you took the effort to come here from Bonn and from all various cities. I heard from Dresden and other cities. And I would like to hand over to Mr. Müller-Mahn, who is going to introduce you to the next 1.5 hours and run you through the program. Welcome, Mr. Müller-Mahn. Stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. As already said, my name is Detlef Müller-Mahn. I'm from the University of Bonn, and together with my colleagues also from Bonn, we would like to take you to Africa and into the future. So these are two places which are not really in the neighborhood, but somewhere around the corner. Africa, when you just walk over there, just look at what we have over here, crocodiles and what's that, turtles, snakes. In the next room is a lion, a zebra. So Africa is here. But that's not really the question we are asking, because the topic of our talk is the future lies in Africa. My question, first of all, would be, has anybody of you ever been in Africa? I mean, I have. Okay, welcome. So we have experts in the room, and I'm looking forward to your questions. The future lies in Africa. This statement with an exclamation mark behind it is a statement, and the statement may be understood in different directions. One direction is that African futures are related to our futures, and we are somehow sharing common futures, so Africa is important for our own future. But it may also be read in the direction, and that is more what we are exploring, that societies and people living in Africa do have experiences in managing their futures which we do not have, or at least not in the same way. And that is the overarching question of our panel. So what can we learn from the way how people and societies in Africa make their own futures? And to take you, before I present the program, to take you to a place where I've just been a month ago with a student group. This is a wall painting in a part of Nairobi, apparently, or that's what people say, one of the biggest slum areas in Africa, where young people have painted a wall with this painting of Imagine Tomorrow. It's a painting of how these young people imagine their place, Kibera, to be in a couple of years. And the amazing thing, when you look at this wall painting, is that it doesn't look much different from how it looks today. It looks like that, with some small differences. And that characterizes tomorrow from the view of these young people. There's photovoltaic on the rooftops, clean water in sanitation tanks. There's a recycling bin. The river that is flowing through Kibera at the moment is heavily polluted. And here you can see people are even bathing in that river. So there are differences in the imagination of the future, but not much. This is a future that is very realistic. It can be made to happen. And that's what we are interested in the presentations you're going to hear today. So I'm going to talk briefly about the relevance of uncertainty and of managing uncertainty in order to produce your own futures. The next one will be Juliet from Kenya, who's talking about science, policy, and practice in the African context. Then Ananou Gabin, where are you, Ananou? Is going to talk about capacity building as a part of the solution for sustainable development. Vincent, who's currently a master's student, a PhD student. You were a master's student with us. Now you're a PhD student in the Collaborative Research Center, is talking about current and future expectations in Africa through outsourcing research. And finally, Lisa, who's co-organizing this panel, is going to talk about the future under a just socio-ecological transformation, how to get there. That's the program for today. And let us first have a look at debates about African futures that you can often read in the newspapers or see in TV documentaries. So until the turn of the century, the images created about Africa in Western media were very dark and pessimistic. So Africa was often described as the hopeless continent. After the turn of the millennium, this turned exactly into the opposite. So Africa, the hopeful continent, Africa rising with very high growth rates of African economies for a couple of years. And today we don't really know where we are. So some countries are still relatively stable, others are slipping into heavy economic and political crisis. What's important and what I find interesting is the subtitle of this recent edition of the New African, which says, how to build a fairer future. So it doesn't matter to complain about problems, but what matters is how to make a difference between today and tomorrow. What we can see in these public debates about Africa is somehow a dichotomy of potentials and challenges. Just looking at the potentials, what is often discussed is the demographic dividend. So African societies are by far the youngest populations of the world. A lot of young people who want to work. A growing middle class across many African countries, which is seen as a source of hope for processes of modernization and democratization. New technologies like mobile phones allow for leapfrogging developments like mobile money, something that is much more developed in many parts of Africa than here in Germany. It's much easier to use your smartphone to transfer money when you're traveling through Kenya than doing things like that in Germany. And also the telephone network, the mobile network in Kenya, I would say is better than in Mecklenburg or Brandenburg. And of course, something that's often referred to is the existing natural resources as a basis of economic growth. On the other hand, there are, of course, also challenges. Demographic dividend, that would be the positive side of it, but overpopulation and unemployment would be on the other side of the coin. Growing middle classes, yes, but only depending on how you define a middle class. A large part of middle classes in Africa are called floating middle classes. These are people who can afford some standard of living, but only on a very insecure basis. They may easily fall back below the poverty line if a family member, for example, gets ill and they have to sell their house because they have no insurance. Social disparities, poverty, vulnerability are prevailing all over the continent. So these problems are not solved and they're actually growing. So the number of people below the poverty in Africa is growing again, although the percentage is decreasing. This goes along with political instability, insecurity, the phenomenon of so-called weak states. These are phenomena that one simply has to acknowledge. This is a fact in many, but not in all, African countries. And finally, of course, the problems of climate change and the problems of adaptation to climate change, which are more severe in Africa than in most other parts of the world. potentials and challenges translate into a very high level of uncertainty. Uncertainty meaning that we do not really know what's going to happen. And that makes it very difficult to prepare for the future, as long as you don't know what you don't know. And this raises a number of important questions which we want to tackle and which we are dealing with in a number of research projects I'm going to introduce in a minute in Bonn. So the first question is, how can we manage uncertainty for sustainable futures? How to get along with something that you don't know in the future? This is something, and that's our starting hypothesis, where we believe many people in Africa have more experience in living with uncertainty than we have. We in Germany, we tend to take everything for granted. And then it's a major catastrophe if the Deutsche Bahn doesn't arrive on time. So, I mean, when you're traveling through Kenya, you know that this is going to happen. But looking at this question, how can we manage uncertainty? The real question is, who is we? So who manages these processes? Who is responsible for African futures? This question is not at all trivial. And finally, what can the world learn from Africa? These are the underlying questions of the coming session. And now I just want to briefly take you through a few examples of what we are doing. One thing that we're interested in is the power of vision, of great imaginations that are driving societies into a future that is described in bright pictures with big promises. We talked about the mega projects. So mega projects contain a promise into the future. And one of the promises many African governments are making to their populations is that their countries will be developed along with so-called development corridors. So what they're doing there, and that's what you see here on the left side, what they're doing there is that the whole of the African continent is crisscrossed by development corridors, roads, pipelines, power lines, gas pipelines, and urban centers. Yet much of these development corridors only exist on maps. They're not there. They're beginning somewhere. They have a lot of holes and gaps in between, but still these imaginations of development corridors do leave traces on the ground. And that is something we are studying. For example, when you look at this image picture of a road crossing in the north of Kenya, when you know that area in the north of Kenya today, this is empty. Well, it's not empty, but it's savanna. So every 50 meters you have a tree. In the imagination of the planners, this is going to develop into an urban center. Even if this urban center is not yet there, it leaves traces on the ground. It does a lot of changes with the local population. And that is something we are studying in our project. So the question is, how are visions constructed, by whom and for whom? And how do the Africans themselves, the people living at this place in the north of Kenya, how do they themselves think about their own futures? And this is what I want to show you now by Noops.
Yaani ni kwamba malengo yangu ni kwamba baadaye nipate shamba langu mwenyewe kubwa na mimi nianze kulima kwa ajili ya nini?
Aji Daudi Mutui. Asito hiyo na biharani ongishu na yelo namali ne ke mari ongishu ke garara na gara nyanga ngishu nkujit tangara gi alame yo rodo. Yolo nara rari na bihara nara rabe gias ne do ngishu.
Nasababisha sana kupoteza muda. Sasa najua muda ni mali sana. Unapotukosa muda hata maendeleo kidogo yanarudi nyuma.
In the future, will be determined by the definitions that, that borders have been given. Space and borders would always go together in determining the future use of land, which is very important for rural African communities. Future in this case of these rural communities are highly influenced by the definition that different actors put in these spatial reorganization processes.
The major conflict is not between dreams and reality, but between dreams and other dreams. So that reality, so to speak, is actually produced by the contestation between dreamscapes. So the real is actually a kind of sedimentation of the battlefield of dreams.
Africa is moving towards creating its own modernity. This will affect development in rural areas as well, potentially creating more inclusion and genuine participation that will give the power to shape both the process and outcome of a transforming future Africa.
Okay, so the idea of what I showed you was to show you that the future from an African perspective is a battlefield of dreams. It's not one future, but many futures, and we need to talk about futures in plural, not in singular. This somehow embraces the phenomenon, the unavoidable phenomenon, that futures are open, they're not decided. There are some pathways into the future, but uncertainty is a condition both in Africa and in Europe, and we can't avoid it. What we can learn from Africa, and that's what I want to show you in my last slide, is something that we are currently approaching in a large interdisciplinary research project at the Universities of Bonn and Cologne, a project financed by the German Research Foundation, DFG, under the title Future Making and Socio-Ecological Transformation. And the idea of what we are studying here is to understand how three different types or processes of socio-ecological transformation help to embrace uncertainty, to get along with uncertainty. These three processes are, first of all, something that we call infrastructuring. That is the production and the creation of infrastructure like roads and pipelines, what I mentioned before. Secondly, it's processes of intensification, especially in agriculture, with large-scale, often irrigated agriculture, centrally managed in order to increase food production for growing populations in Africa. And thirdly, and at first sight this looks somehow like a process in the other direction, it's the process of conservation, of putting large pieces of land under natural protection and preparing and preserving these pieces of land for wildlife and nature. And we're doing this in 3 countries on the African continent, Kenya, Tanzania, and Namibia. And I'm handing over to the next speaker, Juliet, who is from Kenya. And we are very glad she's been working for us and with us already for a couple of years. Juliet has a degree, a PhD in agriculture, and she did her thesis on a comparison between different types of agricultural production in Kenya, especially between organic production and conventional agricultural production.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to take over from Detlef. He has been my boss before. I've worked with him. Today, I'm going to divert a little bit from talking about the general case of Africa, the uncertainties per se, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the science, policy, practice, context. And we talk about this because as much as science is producing knowledge and policies are made and what people are doing on the ground, there is a disconnect that the knowledge produced sometimes by science is not getting to politicians or is not being utilized. And on the other hand, the practitioners also are not using this knowledge. So I'm going to introduce the concept of the science policy practice interface. And people have been talking a lot about science and policy, but also forgetting about the practice sector. And what we call the SPPIs, that's what I'll call them. And these are the diverse ways in which scientists, policymakers, and other practitioners communicate, they engage, they exchange ideas to develop knowledge jointly, to enrich policy and decision-making processes. So the next slide, I'm going to show you a case example of a project that I'm working on, and it's called the AFAS project, sorry. And this is about a 2.8 million project funded by the Federal Foreign Office, and it's a consortium of 4 universities. The University of Bonn, the University of Cologne, and we have 2 graduate centers in the University of Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, and we have the University of Nairobi in Kenya. And this project has several work packages. So we have a graduate program, an MSc PhD program, and also we encourage these students to stay abroad. They can come to Germany or they can travel within Africa. And we have stakeholders from the different science, practice, and policy phases. And we also do a lot of research. The main focus of this program is to do research on climate change adaptation mostly, and biodiversity conservation. So I'm going to focus on the third sector, which is stakeholder engagement, where we are talking about the science, policy, practice interface. And this is an example of an activity we had with stakeholders recently in Berlin. You can see the minister there of Foreign Affairs, representing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We had students who had come from all over the world, from Latin America, and scientists and practitioners also, from Asia, from Africa, and other parts of the world. And so some of the activities we do to engage with stakeholders, we've had stakeholders workshops. So this year we have had two in Abidjan, and we've had a conference there. We were part of the UNCCD COP, and I'm going to focus on the last. I'm going to give you a case example of some kind of what people there in African countries are thinking about this science, policy, practice, engagement in a workshop that I recently came back from, held on October 25th in Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire. So this is lessons from 2 projects. We have AFAS and we have CABES. So CABES is another big consortium project, also a capacity building project called Capacity Development for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in West and East Africa. And AFAS is in East Africa and also in Western Africa. So we asked the people, we asked the stakeholders, what do you think are the challenges in dealing with the big challenges of today, climate change, food insecurity, poverty, in Africa, for example. So what are the challenges? Where is there a disconnect between the knowledge that is being produced and what is actually happening on the ground? So what is making these recommendations projects made by policymakers or made by scientists, the knowledge from scientists, what is making it not actually be practiced on the ground? And I think you can read for yourself, but I can highlight some. They're talking about lack of integration, where science is working in silos, politicians work alone, and the business works alone. And also they work for their own interests. So for example, business wants profits, and politicians are trying to balance between different needs of, are we going to deal with constructing a road, or poverty, or dealing with COVID? What are we going to do? So and then there's also a disconnect between academic innovations and what is aligning with the business. So when you produce science, when you produce research today, is it really useful for people out there? Is it useful for the farmers? Is it useful for the business sector? And we also have lack and underfunding of national funding. So most of the projects the big mega projects, like the ones we do, are funded from Germany, they are funded from the US, they are funded from Japan. So this is, when projects are funded from here, that means that the agenda that is driven by the German government or the US government is what is going to be researched on. But sometimes local problems of exactly what they are dealing with is not really captured in, so basically sometimes local problems are not dealt with, and this is a disadvantage or a fault somehow of the local people, because if local governments funded locally, then maybe they would be able to deal more with local problems and their own research priorities and their interventions on the ground. And then also there is, of course, a missing dialogue between different actors. They're not talking to each other, so of course there is duplications and redundancy. And for us, because we are a capacity building program, we have curriculum mismatch. So what people are learning in universities or technical education is not really what is useful out there for the world, basically. So you produce graduates that go to the world and they're missing some soft skills, for example, that are important for hiring in these sectors. And other constraints that we saw that there were different ways of working. This one I already mentioned, where people progress their own interests, poor communication, especially of academic output. So when we write, we produce work as scientists and we put it in policy briefs, sometimes our policy makers do not read those briefs. And how else can we engage the policy makers and the people on the ground to actually perform better? So the others you can read for yourself. And the other one of the main factors also why some of the interventions fail is because they are time bound. So for example, projects are 5, 10, 3 years. So after that, then there is no goodwill to continue and they're not sustainable. So they proposed solutions, and part of the solutions were, they said that people need to find a common ground, that every person comes with their own agenda, but people find a compromise in between, that not every like if the politicians have their agenda, they're not the only ones benefiting. So if there is, for example, an agenda of conserving a national park, for example, or conserving a certain species, that the local community is not deprived of food or jobs. And the other one is to create a common understanding on issues. And I'm not going to read the rest. Please read them for yourself in the interest of time. And in terms of local funding, we said that we should have more funding, especially in our context. And normally, when we produce products in science especially, how do we convince businesses and local stakeholders and the government to invest in them? If you produce something today maybe for conservation, or you produce an innovation, if you put a money market, if you put a dollar value to it, it's easier to get buy-in, and probably it's easier for it to be more sustainable than if you produce something that looks very nice and very good, but nobody knows how am I going to benefit financially from this. Because we have to remember that people look at, if you're looking at interventions or any solutions that we propose to people in Africa or even here, they have to be economically viable, they have to be socially accepted and viable as well. And of course, in the current world, they have to be environmentally sound. And communication. So this is very important, training of people. This is missing a little bit, and especially the disconnect between what is actually taught and what is actually needed out there. So what we do right now is we go and in these stakeholder workshops, we ask the business sector, what is it that you need from our students when they graduate? Apart from the knowledge of this is a certain species and this is a certain equation in math and this is whatever, what is it that you actually need for these students to know? Maybe they just need them to know how to communicate better or type better or manage time better, and maybe these are skills that could be taught, can be added into the curriculum. So thank you so much. We are funded by the Federal Foreign Office, and we are part of the 4 DAD Global Climate and Environment Centers. Thank you.
So we now have a little bit of time for
short discussion on the interesting presentations that we saw. And before I'll give the word also to the audience to ask some questions, I might start with one. And my first question goes to you, Detlef. So uncertainties, for most people, uncertainties are rather something bad. If I don't know what is going to happen, then I can't really prepare. Why do you think that uncertainties can also be something good in the context of maybe of Africa, but maybe even in our own context?
Imagine everything was predetermined, then I mean, we wouldn't have the liberty to make decisions and to take a choice. So uncertainty may also be seen as a resource, as an open future where people may make their own choice for their futures. And uncertainty, to some extent, also is the background to something that we need when we approach our futures, for hope. Because if everything is determined, there is no space for hope. That means uncertainty, I would rather see it as a neutral category, something that opens the future to intervention and to choice, and that leaves room for hope into the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Juliet, maybe a question to you. So when we think about uncertainties, where do you see maybe a major difference also about how people are dealing with uncertainties in an African context or versus a European context?
I think Detlef already mentioned, I think where I come from, people are a little bit more used to uncertainties. You can be sleeping and there can be, I don't know, a flood, or sometimes, I don't know, we have droughts, like we have occurrence of different climatic and other kind of shocks, even the market shocks. So I find that people there are a little bit more resilient, and people here are used to a more structured system. Like when we had the rain in North Rhine-Westphalia here in Bonn the other day, and in Avila, I think it really shocked us, and we don't know how to react quickly, or even if we do, then somehow I think COVID also has shown us that some people are more resilient with shocks more than others, and I think the developing world, not just Africa, people are more used to shocks and probably they torture them less psychologically than they do people here, I would say.
Do you think that could be also a model for us to learn from?
Yeah, to be a bit more relaxed, yeah.
Okay. Detlef, you want to say something?
Just very briefly, and then I hand over to you. I think Aval is a good example to show us what went wrong with the feeling of the people in Avala, where everybody relied on the authorities. So the government to be in control, the police and whoever. And then when the authorities, the institutions that are there for disaster prevention fail, and they did fail, then we have a major catastrophe. I'm sure something like that would not have happened in Africa because nobody waits for the government or the army. All people rely on themselves. They know when you call the police, they won't come right away, but they rely on themselves and they help themselves and rely much more on each other in solidarity groups within families and neighborhoods.
Thank you very much. I have a question concerning the urbanization that you mentioned, that many people are moving from the countryside into cities, and UN says by 2050 there will be 70% living in cities. And how does this link to the intensification and the infrastructure of food production and transport and everything? So what is the solution that we can learn from them concerning urban futures?
Shall I answer right away?
Yes, please.
So, yes, I guess it's an important question. So already now more than 50% of the population in Africa are living in urban centers, but many people still do have a background in rural areas. And that is also something that I would see as a potential, because these ties between urban centers and the rural background of these people also means there's a flow of capital into rural areas. And what we're observing in Africa, all across the continent, is that many of the large investments are no longer investments from Germany or United Kingdom or China, but these are African investors investing in their own country. Some of these investments may not be very, very nice because people are buying land as a means of speculation. But they do also invest in intensification of agriculture, which then leads to an increase of yields and agricultural production.
So it just seems as though the uncertainties are actually certainties. For example, the infrastructure problems with police not showing up when one calls the police. And so I wonder if it's actually a bigger question and something maybe to research. But when you're talking about collaborating between Germany and the different countries in Africa, if it's rather where does the money go, who provides the money, this question of we. Maybe it's addressing what happens beyond the uncertainties that are actually certainties, such as infrastructure not being sustainable. So it actually leads more to what you're discussing about policy and where is the disconnect there. So do you foresee either of you foresee any type of collaboration that actually discusses that? So what's beyond what is currently certain that you are claiming are uncertainties?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question you're asking here. So first of all, this it is almost a bon mot to say there's nothing as certain as uncertainty, not only in Africa, but here as well. So this is somehow an unavoidable condition of our futures, facing uncertainties. What we are interested in our research in this collaborative research center is how the construction of infrastructure, for example, is an attempt to gain control over the future. You may interpret this as an attempt of colonizing the future and putting it into pre-described pathways into the future. And the big question then is where the money goes. Much of the money does in fact not end up in infrastructure construction, but in lots of other purposes which were initially not intended. And these are side effects of these big investments, which you may also call an uncertainty that is somehow built into this kind of projects that we are studying there. I don't know whether I got the whole of your question, but the idea behind it is interesting. Thank you.
You showed this wonderful picture drawn by youth on a possible future. And then you mentioned that Africans don't place much hope in governments. So where should the change come from? In which institutions do Africans have faith? I mean, very difficult to say across the continent. I mean, Pan-Africanism is still a big word. The African Union. I've done some cooperation projects with the African Union. Think tanks, if you can just briefly say something on faith in institutions and actors for change in Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important dimension I didn't talk about, the role of the state in creating futures and in creating opportunities. So if we begin with this picture of the wall painting in Kibera, Kibera is somehow, one may say, an extra-statal area. The state does not really enter. The types of activities you see inside there are all covered by NGOs. And right outside of the gate, when you enter Kibera, a place of something like 250,000 people living there, right outside is a police station. But outside, it's not inside. These people more or less govern what's happening inside of Kibera themselves. And that tells us a lot about their faith in the state. They're doing these things themselves and organizing things through non-governmental organizations. On the other hand, the African Union does, of course, play an important role as a body that somehow presents a platform for the formulation of dreams. The African Union has published a report, a program called Agenda 2063, which is powerful. I mean, much of what is written in there are empty promises. These things are not going to happen the way they were promised. That's your mega projects. Many of these mega projects are not really going to deliver, but part of this is going to happen. And for that reason, I do believe that the African Union as an intergovernmental body and national governments do play an essential role in doing plans for the whole country, whereas the local development, and Kibera is a good example for that, largely remains in the hand of the people themselves.
it varies from country to country. So some countries where there is a little bit more political stability, there is a stronger role of the state. But of course, in a country where there is less political stability and unpredictability of the future, then the state is weaker and people don't trust in them very much. So we have several examples of kind of better practices in terms of governance, but then we have also situations where there's a lot of uncertainty and governments are changing, and of course people do not know who to trust. I come from Kenya. We recently had an election that was about 50-50 contested, and it looks like people really had a say in what the government was doing. So we don't know what the leaders end up doing, but people are interested, and somehow the state is not so much separated from the people, sometimes the way we think. It's kind of the same. It's just that some certain, I don't know, that the promises are made and things are done, but I think it's changing. I don't think it's the way it used to be, that the state can just go and tell people, this is what we are going to do, even locally, because we have a lot of decentralization too. Like, for example, we have local governments and we have big governments, and sometimes even if the leaders at the top are not really implementing what they're supposed to implement at the African Union or the national level, locally, sometimes there's a lot of change, because not just from the people, but also from the local governments, I think.
Also from my side, thank you for the talk. I have one question concerning what you talked about, like the knowledge transfer between academia, politics, and maybe the informal or more rural area, because like I'm coming from the University of Arts, and just started my PhD in design research, and there is another project. They're starting in March, focusing on kind of like the same topic in Togo, how you can better come up with a knowledge transfer between rural areas and the academia sector. And they're focusing a little bit on the students at the universities that actually coming from that background, and seeing if they can maybe function as like a gatekeeper from knowledge from one side to the other side. And I was wondering, because you said there is like a flow of capital back from cities to the rural areas, but is there not also like a flow of knowledge back, or how you can support maybe that exchange?
Something I did not mention, for example, in the AFAS project, the African Future Savannas, I forget AFAS all the time and I'm managing it. So in the project where I'm managing, part of the practice, because we have the science, policy and practice, part of the stakeholders in the practice that people nowadays are encouraging to be included, we call them the indigenous and local communities. So these people have to be, I think it's now acknowledged and accepted that if you try to develop interventions, especially in rural areas, without including these local people, they're likely to fail, especially if you do not include them. So we have community-based organizations, church organizations, indigenous local communities, and just local networks. So what the project tries to do, or what we try to do, is to include them from the beginning. So in this workshop where we did, they came, some of them, and they said, okay, you're telling us this is what the students come and tell us to do in the field, but this is not practical. So they're kind of used. Basically, I think part of the solution lies in including them from the very beginning and including everybody, not just taking maybe the top leaders only, but also including, for example, women and the youth who are actually practicing. And if we try to do interventions like this, really like do it, not just write it on paper, maybe we have better results, especially in the knowledge that is transferred between academia and practice mostly. I hope I've answered your question.
When are we going to pitch the term capacity building? You know, you talked about it, and when we talk about capacity building, it's really about power. What one powerful group sees as a form of effectiveness over another group. And working across the continent for 20 years, it's highly innovative, highly entrepreneurial, highly intelligent, with a ton of indigenous knowledge. So, the federal office and other bodies that are distributing funds have an incredible amount of power to also shift the dialogue and talk about assets rather than deficits. And so I just wanted to see, what are you all thinking about that? And what's some of the things that are happening in the field? And I think one of the reasons why cash direct transfers have been successful has been because it's been about giving funds and allowing people to do with that what they will. And it's been less about capacity building and rather enabling resources and knowledge that's already in the environment. So just want to get your thoughts on that.
I think normally the person who provides the money does dictate the agenda, does dictate the topic, yeah? So it's sometimes really hard for us as scientists to kind of completely divert from what is written on paper as our objectives. That is why I was stressing that it needs local initiatives and local funding from government or the private sector so that their agenda can also be improved. But how do we try and somehow circumvent this is, like this project where we are working is that the money is not staying in Germany. So I showed that the budget, for example, is 2.8 million. 1.9 million is with our stakeholders. It's given to these universities to manage well as they please, but within a certain set of guidelines. But it's really complicated to define an agenda for teaching or something like this without the local people not having also producing something. They have to meet somehow halfway. So I think that the local, for there to be enough like fair capacity building, it needs to come from both sides. It cannot just be driven from the people providing the money. And somehow the way to do this is that they need to chip in something locally. But somehow I see that when you engage stakeholders, for example, in these big debates of the UN and all this, somehow their knowledge nowadays is more accepted than it was in the past. I think it's changing a little bit.
And the capacity building part is actually a good kind of point, because that's what we'll now be talking more about, what Professor Ananou will be talking about, who's with us also here today. And let me just briefly introduce him to you. So he is the head of the coordination team of the climate competence centers, WASCAL and SASCAL, which are based in West Africa and Southern Africa. And he's working for the project agency DLR. But he's also a professor for science management at the University of Applied Science Mittweida and professor for climate change and diplomacy in the Gambia University. So thank you very much for joining us today, Ananou.
Thank you very much. I have been given only 10 minutes to make my presentation. I would love to have more time and explain more. My presentation is going to respond a little bit to the questions raised by the audience and also complete the presentation of Juliet. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me to Berlin for this occasion. I will give some ideas. I'm working as a science manager between scientists and policymakers and end users. And from that perspective, I have another approach about how best we can manage uncertainties in Africa, in Africa's future. Detlef raised a question during his presentation, how we can best manage uncertainties in Africa. If this is from the German perspective, I will say that normally we don't need at all to bother ourselves and find solutions for the sustainable development of Africa. It is the job of the Africans themselves to think about how best they can manage the uncertainties and find solutions. What we can do from our side, from the German side, is to support them in their activities and support them in their initiative. So for us, we from the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, we have chosen a topic which is common now and global for discussions, the topic of climate change. And we would like to support Africa, which is suffering more than our continent and having more impact from the climate change. So, the rationale behind our engagement is that we would like to engage Germany more in the context of collaboration with Africa. I may recall that for us in Germany, most of the, we love cooperating with developing, not developing, but let's say developed countries, Canada, US. Our scientists, they prefer going out and work in those countries than to go to Africa. We have very, very few people who go to Africa like Detlef and support science than on the ground. We would like, with our initiative, to support more and then to diversify our engagement vis-à-vis Africa. We have been supporting through different funding systems the development there, but we also know that we are not quite satisfied about the results we have actually. So, if we know that science is the driver of development, if we know that science is the driver of the future, so we need to collaborate with African partners on the field of science so that in the future they can themselves find solutions for the problems on the ground. This is why we have initiated this strong project of capacity building. Before we could get there, also to respond to some of the questions and to the presentation of Juliet, so we have initiated what we call agenda process. The agenda process helps us in the countries of the partners to define together the priorities, what they would like to have, which field they would like to have for the collaboration with us. We, in the new approach, we never define for our partners in Africa what they would like to have. So they tell us, we ask our friends in Togo, what is your priority in science? What would you like to have for the development of your country? And then they do a consultation with scientists, with policy makers, with communities, and then with end users to find out and define the priority they would like to have in Togo. And then we, the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, we intervene to support the idea by funding and also by involving our German scientists in the project. This is what we have been doing many years with ZEF in Bonn. So ZEF has been our strongest German partner in Africa for the collaboration with all the partner countries. So, and one point is very important. We are not just giving funds to Africa because we have a lot of money here. We are giving the funds to do research in Africa, also because we would like to change the patterns. We would like to show the world that we are also taking responsibility for the development in Africa. But we are also looking, by giving funds, we are looking for opportunities for our scientists to go to Africa and do basic research there, what is difficult today in Western Europe. So our scientists get then the opportunity to go to Africa and do science together with our partners on the ground. And finally, by doing this, we invest also in our relationship with Africa for the future, and also for them to support our decisions. So when Germany, for example, at the next negotiations on climate change in Egypt, when the German ministers are going there, they will be talking, they will be presenting the concept of Germany, but they need partners to come and support them on the ideas so that when it comes to vote, those African partners can be on our side and support our vote, and the voice of Germany can go far and then make some decisions possible. This is why we are investing there. We are not investing only because we are interested only in the development of Africa. We are doing this also for us. So, for the capacity building program, we are initiating in most of the regions. So we ask the partners not to focus only on one discipline, but on many, many disciplines so that we can have an interaction between the topics and then find best solutions for the region. So as said, during the agenda process, we call different scientists who may make proposals on the topics which are interesting for them. If you go to, yes, 2 minutes? Oh, then let me go very, very quick. So what we have initiated as interdisciplinary program in the region on climate change is that, for example, in Senegal, they have done their agenda process and told us what is important for them is the impact of climate change on economics, on economic development. So we supported them then to put on the place a program to capacitate young scientists which are now working on this topic and finding good solutions for the region. So for Benin, for example, it is on climate change and water resource management. This helps also the region to have experts who are finding solutions for their own country. The relation from there, for example, to the work of GIZ is that you know already that GIZ send normally experts to Africa to find solutions and then work for Africa. The situation we have now is that we are capacitating the expert, the African expert on the ground, and they find solutions, specific solutions for the problem on the ground. So I have to run very quick. So we have here some figures. We have many PhD programs in the region. I am personally the impression that we don't need anymore to support Africa putting in place primary schools. We don't need to go to Africa and help them finding solutions in the villages for school patterns. What we can do is to support the elite, to support people who are able to find solutions, people who are making decisions, and this is why we are capacitating so much people in the region. Actually, we have more than 271 students who have successfully graduated and have their doctorate degree and working in different institutions, working in the administration, and then working for the best of the African region. So we have the same program in West Africa, and we have just started in the southern part of Africa. All those programs are funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and I have the fortunate position to coordinate and manage all those programs. So we have, as I said, created through that capacity building a lot of professionals who are now working in different institutions. 95% of them, 95%, got a good job in UN institutions, in the government, and in the academia. So we have also put, by the recruitment and by the capacity building programs, focus on the support for female students. We have created a special program for their recruitment, also to support, to have a gender balance. Actually, we are by 30%, but we hope that in the future we will go beyond this percentage. So, very quick, by doing this, we create for our scientists in the region access to more international cooperation. We give them opportunity to attend different programs in the world and work together with our scientists, but also scientists coming from the entire world. I would like to stop here and take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
My name is Vincent, and I'm currently doing my PhD in the Future Rural Africa that was already introduced. And what I'm doing is trying to assess the role of rural infrastructure in socio-ecological transformation of African countries, for example, Kenya and Namibia. I think I am lucky actually to be doing this PhD under this consortium of institutions, having had my master's here in Germany and now doing my PhD. What do I mean by being lucky? I'm just one of the very many young Africans who aspire actually to do their PhD or actually start training for a future career in research. And by saying that, I think I will try to illustrate that with this figure, which I really found very interesting. And in this figure, you can see on this side, there is an illustration of how countries are actually investing in research. And on this side, you can see the number of researchers per 1 million people. And you can hardly see African countries out of the 54 that we only have 2 African countries, South Africa and Egypt, which you can actually struggle to see, committing less than 1% of their GDP and with less than 1,000 researchers per 1 million. This figure is interesting because then it raises the question, where are other African countries? With that, we learned that pre-COVID, actually from 2018 to 2020, African countries consistently spent less than 1% of their GDP. And this only contributes 2% of the research output. And this begs the question, what does this say about a continent that has 20% of the global population with so many challenges, only investing this amount of their money on research and development and generating this output of research? And with that, then we ask, while we appreciate the role of projects like the one I'm doing my PhD, to what extent will this kind of foreign-funded projects fill in the gap to answer many problems, to solve many problems that Africa is facing as a continent? Then, a rhetorical question there is, what are the priorities of the African states in terms of research? Is it that most of our policymakers are only ignorant, they do not appreciate the role of research in contributing to the African development? Or is it that we have very few resources and that need to be invested in other sectors that are deemed to be more important than the research itself? So that as it may, we realize that Africa, or the developing world, has different challenges and it has actually different opportunities. Just reiterating what most of the presenters have already said, we are facing a crisis, for example, of climate change. And the world in the global north has a different agenda of, for example, mitigating and decarbonizing, while in the global south, we are talking about adaptation and clean development. With the initial slide that I showed you, it's very clear that we cannot rely on outside funded projects to help Africans forge a clear path of clean development and adaptation. Because every part of the world with its own challenges, they will try to solve their own pressing issues. And with this, therefore, it means that there is actually need for changing focus to local research, and this will mean investing in local young people like myself to help come up with very innovative solutions to address the local challenges that might not be seen by researchers, especially coming from outside Africa. And having said that, there are very important lessons that we can actually borrow from the still going on pandemic of COVID, that investing in research, especially in some African countries that performed better on how they handled the COVID crisis, is that those countries that had a marginal advantage in terms of research showed a better way of collaborating with other countries to manage the COVID crisis. So, so with that, there's need to really appreciate the role of research and invest in it if we look forward into similar kind of pandemics that are very imminent in the coming days. So with those perspectives, and as the future we have been told is very uncertain, it presents hope and fear. First, the fear will come as a dark side. We're talking about investing in research. But if we continue with the current policies of underfunding and poor policies supporting research, and generally poor development in our countries, obviously, already the immediate former presenter talked about researchers leaving Africa, flying. And if you may, you can call that a brain drain. If this is the trend, and if things don't change, then we will be in a vicious cycle of having many problems that cannot be addressed by our research, and that we will fall short of researchers in Africa to address those problems. And this is the dark side. If we look at the good side, somebody already mentioned the AU Agenda 2063. This one sets and suggests that each country should invest at least 1% of their GDP on research. But these are just but aspirations. How many countries are going to implement this? And I believe that if countries will invest this amount of suggested resources and continue cultivating the kind of collaborations that have already been presented, then Africa will be in the right trajectory in terms of research that will help solve the problems. And I submit that is my hope for the future research landscape in Africa. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. Microphones. Thank you very much, Vincent, for the nice talk. Again, we'll have the discussion after my presentation that is now to follow. So I actually forgot to introduce myself before. So my name is Lisa Biber-Freudenberger. I'm a junior professor at the University of Bonn at the Center for Development Research, and also working in the project Future Role Africa. So let me just start my presentation very quickly. Okay, so what I'll be talking about is how could that future look like under a just socio-ecological transformation, and how could we maybe also get there? So let me start with that picture here, and maybe some of you know it. It's called the Blue Marble, and it's basically a picture of the Earth taken from outer space, and that was in the 70s by the astronauts of the Apollo 17. And that kind of started the whole sustainability movement that is still going on today, because for the first time, it kind of showed us, first of all, how beautiful the Earth is, but also how limited the land is that is available to satisfy all the different needs that we are having. And I think what's also interesting about this picture is that it focuses very much on Africa. When it was used then on Time magazine and so on, it was actually turned around because people couldn't orient, because they didn't understand what we are looking at, because most of them came from Europe or the US, and they had no clue what continent that was. Okay, so, but because of that limitation in terms of land that we are looking at, we are also facing quite a number of challenges, and this includes degradation of soil and ecosystems, loss of forests and biodiversity. We also have the whole issue of climate change. Hunger and poverty has also been on our agenda for quite a long time and continues to be, because we haven't really solved it. But it's also a question about the distribution and the access to land and resources, which is not uniformly distributed around the world, and also not within Africa. And all of these challenges are, of course, not just standing next to each other, but they are very much interlinked with each other. Now, you know the Sustainable Development Goals, and you probably know that picture where they're all standing next to each other. And the United Nations basically came up with this wish list of what they would like to achieve by 2030. However, when we think about it, they are actually not just standing next to each other. There are certain goals that actually are maybe more profound to achieving the other goals than the others. So to put that here into perspective, this is a figure which is called also the SDG wedding cake. There are certain goals, and they have to do with the biosphere, that are required to actually have a healthy society. So only if we have a healthy biosphere, we can have a healthy society. And only if we have a healthy society, we can have a working economy. And that kind of is what is called the hierarchy within the SDGs and what I would call also the ecological imperative. So we have to conserve biodiversity to achieve all of the other goals. And that is also something that the CBD acknowledges, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And when we are looking, however, how the trend has been for biodiversity, we can see that it has been decreasing and it will continue to decrease if we continue with a business as usual. If we continue our conservation efforts, we increase the number of protected areas and so on, we might make this yellow line, which would be already pretty great, but it would not really turn the whole thing around. But to really make a difference and to serve that ecological paradigm, what we actually need is not only increased conservation efforts, but we need more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption. So bending this curve on biodiversity loss requires actually something that we call the socio-ecological transformation, where we are not just looking at one aspect, but the whole society and the way how we are doing also business. However, when we are looking at what has been happening, we have to acknowledge that our ecological footprint and the amount of resources that humanity needs has been increasing steadily over time, and thereby the ecological deficit has been increasing. So basically the debt that we are having in terms of ecological resources. Now that has not been uniformly distributed, of course, but by doing also international trade, what we have also been doing is we have kind of been exporting the negative impacts of these increasing consumption to other countries. And many of these countries where now the environmental impacts in terms of deforestation are happening are actually not within the countries where the consumption is happening. And you can see that here. So we have these kind of externalization effects of our consumption due to international trade. Now, of course, we kind of all know this, right? But there's still this gap between what we should do and maybe even we want to do, but what we are actually doing in real practice. And so the question, how can we get this transformation going? And then there are certain barriers to this, which are basically the distance from the problem, the doom perspective, the kind of decoupling, which is called also dissonance. We are also denying actually that the problem might be there. And then it also has to do maybe with our identity and what we feel we are in terms of what we also deserve in our life. So there are these different barriers to it. And so what we actually have to think about is how could this future look like? How could a desirable future look like that is also inclusive? And how could these future scenarios look like, where we are engaging society in the development of these scenarios? And there's something that's called the Nature Futures Framework, which I'll just very briefly introduce, which was just recently actually published, where you can see that, well, there are these kind of different perspectives on how we are interacting with nature. And it's kind of also a trade-off between those. So one is called Nature for Society. This is like we are getting food from nature and we are prioritizing that. We are basically prioritizing the benefits we as humans are getting from nature. Then others might say, well, no, nature is for me important because it's important to me in terms of culture. It's about living in harmony with nature. It's about being one with nature. And then there are also people who might be saying, no, it's also about the intrinsic value of nature. It has nothing to do with me as a person, but we have to conserve nature simply because it has an intrinsic value. And these are kind of three different aspects. And whatever I value in nature might lead to different ways how I'm utilizing land, right? And therefore, there are also these trade-offs between these different dimensions. Now, the problem is I don't only have these trade-offs locally when I'm somewhere, but I actually have them also globally, because values are differing all over the world and within societies, and they can also change over time. And so this makes this whole thing quite complex. And then we also have to acknowledge that one vision of someone living somewhere might be in conflict with the vision of living somewhere, someone living somewhere else. So this, for example, is a picture of a train trail that goes through a protected area in Nairobi, and the people who are living on one end of that train rail might have completely different visions from the people that are actually living around the area where the train is now going. And it's not only the question of spatial distribution of values and visions, but it's also a question of how do future generations, how do they see their future, and what do we actually enable them still to do? And there has been, for example, this ruling in Germany that actually kind of put its foot down and said, well, enough is enough. You can't basically colonize the future of future society, of future generations. Now, when we're looking at the spatial distribution, we also, however, have to acknowledge that this whole sustainability research and the debate about it is highly monopolized by the global north. And this is kind of a result from metadata analysis that we did, where we looked at publications in the field of land use science. So we looked at more than 160,000 studies and analyzed the author's name and their ethnicity and where they came from. And as you can see, there's only very little publications authored in particular by the Black communities. And the reason for that, we have heard multiple times now in the different presentations. So it's highly monopolized, and it is time that we actually include different voices and visions. Now, these are the SDGs as they are usually depicted. And there's one SDG, I think, where we need to do more on, which is the global partnership for the goals. And I have 5 theses which kind of rely on what the other people said and which I hope also steers some discussions, which are, we need to recognize the ecological imperative. There is no future without nature, and we have to acknowledge that finally. We also have to acknowledge that there's a diversity of visions and values, and there might be also conflicts between them, and we somehow have to find a way how to deal with them. To do that, we have to also decolonize the whole sustainability science, the academia around it, and land use debates, creating these partnerships at eye level that we have also been talking about. We have to strengthen the capacities within Africa, but not without doing brain drain, so without actually then bringing the people to Germany afterwards again to get jobs here. And we have to improve the science policy practice interface to contribute actually to the implementation of the findings that we might have in research. And with that, I would like to thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and I would like to ask the others also to join us up here. We've got another 12 minutes or so to discuss what we just heard. So the overarching theme, if I try to summarize, is a partnership in a north-south dimension. And I would start with 3 questions, 1 question to each of you, and then I would hand over to the people in the audience. Ananou, you talked about doing science together with our partners in the Global South. But how is Germany seen as a partner in Africa? Just as a background information, I know you were talking about capacity building, but what we realize in our collaborative research center that we are, of course, not the only research institutions in the global north working in Africa, and we are definitely not the most prominent one and not the most welcome one. So other countries in Europe and other donor agencies are more welcome for very particular reasons. And my question to you would be, how is Germany seen on the side of African universities as a research and partner in capacity building?
Our African partners are seeing the German scientists as very, very trustful, reliable, and then compared to some European scientists, very, how do you call it, very familiar with the topics we are dealing with in Africa. I may say from my experience that some of the scientists in Europe are not giving the same respect to our African partners. And they are complaining about this. But they know when they are working with German scientists, this is based on a very rooted ground, and they like continuing the work with them. And they also appreciate a lot the financial commitment. So when Germany says we will fund this project for you, the project are approved, and then the funds are also given timely so that the project can be realized. So we have a good appreciation from our African partners.
Yes, thank you very much. Vincent, you talked about outsourcing research and research collaboration. My question to you is, what has to change and what has to happen, especially on our side, to put this collaboration on equal terms?
I think what needs to change is, for example, increasing the partnership with African research institutions themselves, rather than getting this kind of projects and doing them from Germany. I think when you involve more partners in Africa, then you will be able to increase the number of participants, for example, who are doing this research from the African perspective, not from the global north side that perhaps, applied for the funding and had their preconceived ideas about the research. So in my opinion, it's about increasing the role of the African institutions in the research itself than, you take the project to Africa, but you remain the big players. African institutions so have to take a big role in this kind of research to have more people involved. I think so.
Okay, thank you. And then, Lisa, your 5 hypotheses are a lot of food for thought. I would like to start with the first one. I'm currently working in Tanzania, and the Tanzanian government is building a huge mega dam inside of a conservation area against the protest of the global community. Now, my question is, and they have a good reason to do so, because they say they need the dam for energy production, for the development of Tanzania. My question concerning the first of your thesis is, you're saying there is no future without nature. Yes, but how much nature is needed?
Well, that's a good question. I think scientists are not ready to answer that, but I mean, maybe it's also the wrong question to ask, because I don't think that nature conservation is currently ranging very high on the priority list of politicians, and that's true for most parts of Africa, but also for Europe. And so climate change, for example, has increased, the priority has been basically increased, and it has moved up on the priority list, but biodiversity conservation still ranges pretty low there. And I think acknowledging that we have to conserve the functionality of ecosystems to support humanity and also to support future development, that there is this connection, this would already go a long way, because I don't think we are really doing that, and I don't think it really has settled into the mindset. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So now we have another 5 or 6 minutes for questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you for the presentations, much appreciated. I would like those of you who actually are from Africa a comparative question, if you let me. When you take China, the emphasis in China for the last 30 years has been on economic development before anything else. And I understand that's been a clear consensus between the country's leadership and the citizens. Where do you see Africa in comparison to China, if it's possible to make such a generalization? And maybe you could focus your answer on the more stable countries of Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, etc.
The situation we have in most of the African countries is that, as you say, China is not interested in research. China is interested in economic relationship, and because of the size of the population, in natural resources. So what is happening is that actually in the framework of that cooperation, China is offering some of the solutions, material solutions to the countries, and at the same time signing contracts to start exploring all the natural resources in the countries. But the reaction of the African countries is very simple. They say, Europe has refused to support us now. Or when they would like to support us, they put a lot of conditions. But we have a population, we have a growing population making pressure on us. We have listened to the example in Uganda. So they want having infrastructure. They want to offer solutions to the population. Otherwise, they will have troubles at the next elections. And unfortunately for our position, but fortunately for their position, China is offering solutions to them. If you go to West Africa, actually, you can wear your boss t-shirt of 150 euros, but you will see also in the region, on the street, people wearing the same boss t-shirt for 7 euros, coming from China, and they are proud to wear this. So what the African countries are experiencing actually is that China is helping them materially to face the challenges of the growing population in terms of infrastructure and even in terms of food security. And they don't care too much about the reaction we are having now here. If you go to most of the countries, the HEBOS are all in the hands of Chinese companies. To build roads, it's Chinese companies. To build airport, Chinese companies. I went last time to Angola. They are building a new airport. It is in Chinese hands. For them, China is providing a quick solution. If that is sustainable, I think we cannot respond to that question now. Thank you.
Hi. Very interesting to hear about the comments regarding China. Actually, I am from China, studying in Germany, political science. I'm from Hertie School. So I wonder, I have a very quick reflective comment and a very quick question. The reflective comments is that...
The question.
Am I allowed? Yeah. So I have a very quick comment and a question. The comment's been, I think, what's happening in Africa regarding like the prevalence, prioritize economic development and then kind of ignorance on the fundamental research part actually happens exactly the same in China. So it's kind of universal from the China angle that the current administrative government wants to do that, and they do that quite consistently the same way. So that's kind of to compensate, to provide another perspective, I would say. And then my question here is that actually, I think China and globally have witnessed a quite big ideological change and transformation over the past years, because there was like a how many time, or maybe kind of debating but still okay time, but right now it's kind of been very much polarized and escalated to a completely different level. So I wonder in terms of like investment or assistance or collaboration, what do you think, to what extent do you think the ideology part impacts the perception from Africa? Say, for example, compare China and Germany. Why Chinese part is considered kind of invading, but the German side is more of a friendly angle? Thank you.
For what I have seen myself, I have been engaged in different consultations between Chinese partners and some of the African countries. The ideology doesn't play a role, really. What the African countries want is just a support, material support for the economic development. And they are getting this at a high price of what we all know already. But the new, what is happening now between the African countries and Russia is showing me exactly what was the situation before. The African countries, they need just support. And with the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia now. So Europe doesn't have any more the resources to support Africa. But Russia is saying, if you are on our side, we will support you. And then some of the African countries are just getting now material support from Russia, not because they like the president of Russia very particularly, but just because they need solutions from Russia to face the challenges in the countries. This is what is happening.
Maybe from my perspective, I mean, I don't think it's as you were saying, it's a question of ideology. I think when it comes down to what's written in the contracts about investments and so on, that's what we have to look at, right? And I haven't done any study on this. I'm pretty sure there are some on this. But if we look then at the terms and conditions and these things, the question is, you know, what are they when we are looking at China versus Germany, for example, if there are any differences. And I also think we shouldn't kid ourselves. There is also, of course, a German interest to invest in Africa in terms of our own economic prosperity. Yeah? And there are companies who are just investing for that, you know, to basically make money out of Africa. And the same is true for China. And then there are, of course, also companies within China and within Germany that are maybe not only interested in making money, but maybe also have a different agenda. In the end, I think it comes back to the government and what they do in terms of regulating these investments and what kind of restrictions they put on these investments and what they are allowed to do and what they are not allowed to do. What I think needs to be strengthened is basically the role of the African governments in these debates in not basically selling out their natural resources. I think that is something that is crucial and that we should also from a European perspective support, not only for our own sake, but also for the sake of the whole world, basically. Yeah?
Okay, we've come to an end of this session, and before we are going to be kicked out, let me just very briefly highlight 2 or 3 things that we have learned in this session. One thing was that we believe, and we've given you some examples, that one of the challenges of the future, both here in Germany and in Africa, is the issue of uncertainty. And we believe that there is something we can learn from African societies in managing and living with uncertainties and using uncertainties as an opportunity, as a chance to make decisions and to shape futures into a desirable direction. In order to arrive at that goal, that was the second half of our presentations today, we do need research cooperation and capacity building on equal terms between agencies in Germany and our partners in Africa. We've done a great progress in this direction over the past 2 decades, but we have not yet arrived where we need to go. So we believe that the topic of the future is something very important, and that is our title, The Future Lies in Africa. Thank you to the speakers and the discussants. Have a nice day.